Grammarly, but I've done it. So, uh, but I just finished my field education research project in my master's program on the kind of Christianity in America, looking at the polar extremes of Christian nationalism and progressive Christianity, and seeing both of those things.
Right.
And I offer my own definitions of what those things are, so that the whole paper can kind of go off of that framework and all that stuff. But the first part of that is an exegetical paper. It's about 15 pages of just exegetical work on Matthew 22:15 through 21. Obviously, this is the story where you have the Herodians and you have the Pharisees both coming to Jesus and saying,
You said
here's
Matthew 23?
22:15 through 21. And I know I'm
Just
cold.
pulling
I
it
know
up.
I'm cold throwing this out at you.
No, no, no,
So
you're
that's
fine,
why
you're
I
fine.
say
I'm just
I
pulling
don't
it
want
up
to.
so that way I have a reference point.
Well, yeah, I just don't want to have a ton of commentary because I have extensively
Yeah.
studied the passage, and you're just now. I mean, I'm sure you've studied it before, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you have
You're
the
coming at it from having very recent in-depth study. I'm not.
exactly, and I want to be
It's
fair
totally
about
fine.
that. So how would you reconcile with a teaching like that, where Jesus is making acknowledgement of worldly and earthly kingdoms and rulers, while also still keeping, again, the perspective of, hey, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, right? Render to God's what is God's. The only thing that I'll bring up, and then I want to kind of let you go on it, just as you are reading it and those kind of things. How could that inform the way that maybe you believe about some of these things? Because I just see it as a thing of perspective. There's one commentator. This is the only thing I'm going to say about it, and then we can maybe branch off a discussion after that. But I heard a commentator say, if the tax, which is ultimately what the Herodians and the Pharisees were asking Jesus about, is the
Yeah, yeah,
tax
yeah.
fair, right? This commentator said, if um, if the tax belonged to Caesar, right? Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, then render to God's what is God's, which is ultimately ourselves and our hearts and our very being.
Right.
That's what's meant to. So this whole thing of perspective has really jumped out at me about the this passage. And so, how would you deal with passages like this? That Romans 13, I think, is another example of this, where it talks about honoring earthly rulers and those kind of things, and praying for them and interceding for them, while also still acknowledging kind of where they're at. How would you kind of deal with those two passages of scripture, while supporting kind of the things that you are kind of talking about from like a philosophical standpoint, spiritual standpoint as well?
I think that obviously like government and rule is something that is heavily intertwined throughout the entirety of scripture, right? For the majority of the time, there's some kind of government that's happening everywhere that you go. And so I would look at that and I'd look at this particular passage and I'd like to kind of go back to Daniel as a really good example of somebody who very clearly loved God, somebody who was a prophet and was operating in a pagan culture. And so we do not see anything that Daniel does as being explicitly illegal. And what I mean by that is we do not see, and whenever I say explicitly illegal, I'm saying doing something that is outside of not only the governmental law, but outside of like God's divine law, right? And so there are things that you can do, like within America, that are like, what's a good way to communicate this? Just because is outside of the governmental law, does not mean it's outside of God's law. And I think ultimately how we conduct ourselves as Christians operates as the primary there, right? And so God's law is my primary. So, you know, Daniel, as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they absolutely refused to bow down to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar because that goes against God's divine law, right? And so our interaction with the society that we're in puts the law of God as the primary and then the laws of the society and the government as a secondary. And we're able to conduct ourselves and operate within that so long as they're not forcing us to do things that operate explicitly outside of God's divine law. So I would even, you know, I would say this here is that Jesus is not saying that the taxation, right, is necessarily more than or should be obeyed more than Caesar's, right? He's saying ultimately give unto God what is God's. And we're dealing with money here. I don't know what the temple taxation kind of looked like because I understand that there would be money that was given to the temples. And so, this is a passage about money. So that's kind of how I'm looking at it just at face value. I haven't studied this deep enough to maybe provide some context there. But I think what Jesus is implying here is that the rule of the state does not override or does not overthrow the law of God. And I think that's kind of maybe a good primary interpretation there. And so that's
Yeah.
how I kind of look at it, where it's like, man, if the law of the state isn't doing anything to me that is going to directly go against what I believe to be the law of God, then there's no issue there. So even I would go as far as to say, like, hey, they took God out of schools. Is taking God out of a school and take prayer and all this stuff explicitly something I consider to be sinful? This is just my opinion. I don't explicitly think so, but I do think that is a bad omen and something that God takes offense to, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
And that there's a little bit of parsing that you have to do there, but they're doing something wrong, but not something explicitly sinful, in my opinion. Whereas if and me putting my child in that school, so long as they're not saying that they cannot pray and they cannot, partake in what's the word I'm looking for, partake in their own religious practice,
Hmm.
then that's one thing. If they're completely outlawing Christianity as far as its involvement in school in its entirety, that's a
Hmm.
very different issue. So that's kind of where I would parse that there.
Yeah.
But does that answer your question?